Some of the most common questions I get about visiting Rome are how to time your Vatican visits. Questions like, which should you see first, St. Peter's Basilica or the Vatican Museums? If you book the 10:30 dome climb, what time should you show up at St. Peter's Basilica to go through security? What if you book your Vatican Museums tickets and then you subsequently get permission to visit St. Peter's tomb or the Scavi on the same day? Should you visit the Vatican Museums after the Papal Audience? And if so, what time should you book tickets for? In this video, I'm going to answer all your questions about how to time and combine your visits to the Vatican, including the Vatican Museums and the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica, the Papal Audience, the Angelus or the Angelus, St. Peter's Dome, the Vatican Gardens, St. Peter's Square, and a visit to St. Peter's tomb, also known as the Scavi or Vatican Necropolis. The first one's pretty easy, combining a visit to the Vatican Museums where the Sistine Chapel is, and St. Peter's Basilica. They're two completely separate entities and they're in different parts of Vatican City, so you can visit one and not the other, or you can visit them both on the same day if you like, and it really doesn't matter which order you visit them in. Visiting the Vatican Museums and seeing the Sistine Chapel will take about 2 to 2.5 hours. Visiting St. Peter's Basilica can take you anywhere from half an hour to 2 hours, depending on what you do inside. If you just enter St. Peter's Basilica and walk up one side, see the apse, and then walk down the other side and exit, it'll take you 20 to 30 minutes. But you can also spend more time in there. You could visit the Museum of the Treasury. You could go into some of the side chapels and pray. You could attend Mass either in the main area or in any one of the side chapels when there's a Mass happening. You could visit the papal tombs underneath the Basilica. This is free and it is not the same thing as visiting St. Peter's tomb. And you could climb St. Peter's Dome. Now this is kind of a separate visit, and I'm going to cover that separately. One thing you have to consider is the amount of time it takes you to go between St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican Museums. A simple walk between the two is going to take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes depending on how you walk. A typical standard visit to the Vatican can look something like this. You show up at 7 a.m. so you can get into St. Peter's Basilica with minimum wait times. You go through security, you get inside, you visit the Basilica, you wander around, you take some pictures, you spend a little time in there, and about an hour or so later you come out. When you exit the Basilica, you'll find yourself in St. Peter's Square, which is worth a visit in its own right. Let's say that it's around 8:30 or so. You can visit St. Peter's Square and then make your way over to the Vatican Museums. And perhaps you've purchased a ticket for 9:30 a.m., so you're just going to make it for that 9:30 a.m. visit. You spend around 2 hours visiting the museums, making your way to the Sistine Chapel at the end of your visit. After 10-15 minutes or so inside the Sistine Chapel, you then have to make your way back to the exit of the museums, which happens to be in the same place that the entrance is. That walk back to the entrance is not back the way you came, but a different route. And that walk takes about 10 to 15 minutes. So you'll find yourself outside the Vatican Museums, maybe sometime around noon. Another typical way that you could visit the Vatican Museums and St. Peter's Basilica is doing the reverse. If you do it the reverse, the earliest you can visit the Vatican Museums is 8 a.m. when they open. On a typical visit on your own, you'll come out around 10:30, and then you can make your way over to St. Peter's Basilica to get inside around 11 a.m. After about an hour or so inside of St. Peter's Basilica, you come out onto St. Peter's Square, and it's around noon or 1 o'clock, depending on how long you spend inside the Basilica. If you've seen some of my other videos, you may also know that I love to suggest the Pristine Sistine Tour. This is a tour that starts early. You meet at 7:15 a.m. and you go inside the Vatican Museums right when they open at 8 a.m. with your guide. It's a small group tour. You slowly and methodically make your way to the Sistine Chapel. And because it is a guided tour and because Walks of Italy has the permission to do this, they can take you on the shortcut that goes from the Sistine Chapel right down into St. Peter's Square, where the entrance to St. Peter's Basilica is. They then take you inside of St. Peter's Basilica and give you a tour of the Basilica. After the tour ends, you're free to stay in the Basilica and continue visiting other things like the Museum of the Treasury or climbing the Dome. Or of course, you can exit onto St. Peter's Square and end your visit there. This tour is a little over 3.5 hours long, and it gives you a complete visit where you see the Vatican Museums, the Sistine Chapel, and St. Peter's Basilica. It also saves you some time because if you're taking the shortcut shortcut between the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica. You don't have to go all the way back to the entrance of the Vatican Museums, and you don't have to walk all the way around the walls in either direction. And best of all, you get to avoid going through security a second time. So if you take that tour, your decision is made for you. You're going to visit the museums first and the Basilica afterwards. If you're visiting on your own, you can decide to break up this visit over 2 separate days, which I highly recommend if you have the time to do so. Otherwise, I would pick what works for you. In other words, if you want to climb St. Peter's Dome and you want to get really good pictures, you want to be doing that in the afternoon, because in the morning, the sun is right in front of you and your pictures will be washed out. As for visiting the Vatican Museums, I always suggest going first thing when they open or close to closing time. So either at 8:30 a.m. or at 5:30, 6 p.m. On the other hand, some people want to go to St. Peter's Basilica at 7 a.m. when they open, again, because they want to avoid the lines and they like the idea of maybe a quieter visit. So there isn't one right way to visit the Vatican Museums and the Basilica if you're doing it on your own. Just find the times that work for you, but also account for going back and forth between the two sites. And also make sure you account for some downtime or refreshment time. One question people ask me a lot is if it's possible to visit St. Peter's Basilica at 7 a.m. when they open and make it over to the Vatican Museums for an 8 a.m. entry time. In other words, you want to get in on both sites right when they open. Sorry, but this is not feasible. Let's say you get down to St. Peter's Basilica at 10 to 7 in the morning. Let's say that you barely find any queue, and you go through security and you get inside of the Basilica at about 7:10, 7:15 a.m. Let's say that you rush through and you only spend about a half an hour inside the Basilica. Remember, this is by many standards the largest church in the world, so half an hour is not really going to give you time to see it and appreciate it. But even assuming that you leave the Basilica, let's say 7:45, and you rush and race to get around the walls to the entrance of the Vatican Museums, you're going to get there just a little bit after 8 a.m. So maybe you could do it. I think the logistics are just not that easy. And I think that if you really want to enjoy this site, you need a little bit more time and a little bit more leeway between the sites. Maybe to make it easier on yourself, you could try to go to St. Peter's Basilica at 7 a.m. and book an 8:30 a.m. visit to the Vatican Museums. You'd still be a little bit rushed, but it's a little bit more feasible. Your Vatican Museums tickets have about a 15-minute leeway on either side of that entry time. For 8 a.m., obviously you can't go in before 8 a.m., but you could show up about 15 minutes after 8 and still get in. By the same token, if you're going at the end of the day to the Vatican Museum, something that I love to do because it's very relaxed and the lighting is beautiful, what time should you get to St. Peter's Basilica to see it and have enough time to make your way over to the museums for a, say, 5:30 p.m. entry time? In this case, I would advise showing up at St. Peter's Basilica no later than 3:30 p.m. This allows for time standing in line, getting inside the Basilica, enjoying a visit there, making your way out to St. Peter's Square and around the walls over to the museums. And perhaps you might have a little bit of time in between sites to stop for some refreshment. Now let's add in climbing St. Peter's Dome, probably the next most popular thing to see and do at the Vatican. I know not everybody wants to climb St. Peter's Dome, but for those of you who do, you're going to want to know how to include this in your other Vatican visits. The only way to climb St. Peter's Dome is to have already entered St. Peter's Basilica. I have a separate video all about how to climb St. Peter's Dome, so you can watch that if you want more details. In this video, I want to talk about the timing of it. There are 2 parts to climbing St. Peter's Dome. The first part takes you to the roof of St. Peter's Basilica. From there, you can take a short staircase to a ramp that takes you to the inside of the dome. You can walk around part of the perimeter of the dome, getting up close and personal with the mosaics there. And from there, you can also look down into the Basilica. Sometimes there's Mass going on or there's choral singing, and it's really beautiful when you're up in the dome and you can hear this from there. The second part of climbing St. Peter's Dome is to go all the way to the lantern at the tippy top. For the first part of the dome climb, you can either go 231 steps on foot, or you have the option of taking an elevator ride. For the second part of the dome climb, it's 330 more steps and it's all on foot. Many people ask if it's possible to just do the first part and not go all the way to the lantern. Yes, this is definitely possible. You can just go up to the roof, you can go inside the dome and walk around the perimeter, and then you can come back down again. If you do that, you probably need anywhere from half an hour to 45 minutes. If you want to do the complete dome climb from ground floor all the way up to the lantern and then back down again, you're looking at about an hour and a half. The two main questions that I get around timing are, what's the best time of day to do this? And now that there's a booking system that allows you to book your dome climb, how can you include it with your other Vatican visits? The first question is easy. What time of day should you go? Anytime is fine, but you should know that the Basilica faces east, so if you climb in the morning, you're going to have the sun coming up right in front of you, right in your eyes, and your photos will be washed out. So the closer in the day you go towards dusk or sunset, the better your photos are going to come out. You can always climb the dome in the middle of the day, but in summer, I really don't recommend this because it will be hot. As for the second question about booking tickets to the dome, entering St. Peter's Basilica is free, but climbing the dome costs extra. The entrance to the dome opens up sometime around 7:30, 8 o'clock. So at any point when you find yourself inside of St. Peter's Basilica, if you decide you want to climb the dome, you can purchase tickets on site. But there is a new booking system in place, and it works like this. St. Peter's Basilica remains free to visit. The basic thing you can book on this new booking system is a €7 audio guide. That €7 audio guide gets you a shorter security line for getting into St. Peter's Basilica. So while the Basilica is still free, you've paid €7 to kind of get a shorter security line. It's not skip the line, but your line should be shorter. Another option for booking in advance on the official site is to book the dome climb. As I said, the dome opens just a little bit after the Basilica opens at 7 a.m., but the first tickets available to climb the dome are for 10:30 a.m. So if you want to climb the dome anywhere from when the dome opens until 10:30 a.m., you can just buy your tickets on site. Now, they don't run out of dome tickets. There isn't a daily quota. There are a couple of reasons you might want to book your dome tickets in advance. First, you might just want to avoid having to stand in line to purchase your tickets on site. And second, purchasing your dome ticket in advance comes with the €7 audio guide, which in turn gets you a shorter security line for entering St. Peter's Basilica. So here's the thing. The ticket to the dome comes with this funny wording. It says, the offer includes access and a visit to St. Peter's Basilica with a digital audio guide to be completed 90 minutes before the scheduled entry time to the dome. This has caused a lot of confusion, and I get questions about this all the time, so let me clear it up. It sounds like what they're saying is that you must enter the Basilica exactly 90 minutes before your scheduled dome climb, so you have to try to figure out what time to stand in line for security to make it inside 90 minutes before your dome climb. So the answer is this. When you climb St. Peter's Dome, at the end of your dome climb, you come back down and you pop out inside of St. Peter's Basilica. You may notice that they offer tickets for St. Peter's Basilica starting from 9 a.m., but the Basilica opens at 7 a.m. My guess is the idea is that if you want to come to the Basilica early, go ahead and do so. You just won't be able to get into any shorter security line. And the same with the dome. If you get a 10:30 a.m. ticket for the dome, yes, you can show up 90 minutes before, so at 9 a.m., and you'll be able to get into that shorter security line. Basically, you don't need to do any of this stuff online. To visit St. Peter's Basilica, you can show up any time of day from 7 a.m. until they close at 7 p.m. and just stand in the security line. And to climb the dome, you can just do this on site, so anytime the dome is open throughout the day. It closes about an hour before closing time, so around 6 or so, and they start kicking people off around 5:30. So you want to make sure to give yourself enough time to visit the dome before they close it. The bottom line is that you can show up to 90 minutes in advance of your dome climb ticket time, but you can also visit the Basilica after you come down from the dome. So you don't have to show up 90 minutes prior. You can just show up in time for your dome climb and then visit the Basilica after you come down. Another question I get a lot is from people who want to climb St. Peter's Dome after they take the Pristine Sistine Tour. So again, the Pristine Sistine Tour takes you from the Vatican Museums into the Sistine Chapel and then into St. Peter's Basilica. At the end of this tour, which is around noon, your guide will leave you inside the Basilica. From there, you can head to the entrance of the dome and purchase your ticket and climb the dome. If you want to purchase this ticket in advance because you just don't want to risk having to wait in line, you can certainly do so. You don't have to leave the Basilica and then come back in to use that ticket. Your dome climb ticket is going to come with the €7 audio guide, which you can use if you want to, but there's no way to buy the dome climb ticket without that audio guide. If you have a tour with any tour company of the Vatican Museums that ends inside of St. Peter's Basilica, double check with the tour company to confirm what time the tour will end. Then book your dome climb for about half an hour to an hour after that. The reason I say half an hour to an hour is because you may want to further explore the Basilica, you may want to head down into the papal tombs or visit the Museum of the Treasury, you may need to use the restroom. Next, let's talk about how you can include the Papal Audience in your Vatican visit. The Papal Audience is held on Wednesdays when the Pope is in town. You can check his schedule on the Vatican website. It's free to attend the Papal Audience, you just need a ticket. The Papal Audience typically starts somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock. It can vary, but you're going to want to arrive at St. Peter's Square by about 7:30 at the latest if you want a seat, let alone a good seat. I've done this. I've gotten down there at 7 a.m. I've snagged my great seat, and then I waited for the Papal Audience. And you know what? The time passes really quickly. If you just show up around 9 o'clock, you're probably not going to get a seat. You're probably not going to get any space that's anywhere near St. Peter's Square. You're going to be standing pretty far back. So for those of you asking, I'm getting off of a flight or coming in off of a cruise, can I make it to the Papal Audience? The answer is no. Flights and cruises that get in at 6 a.m., 7 a.m., there's no way logistically for you to get off of that plane or boat and into Rome and over to St. Peter's Square in time for you to get a seat, let alone accounting for your luggage that you're going to have with you. So if you're arriving on a Wednesday in Rome, don't count on being able to attend the Papal Audience that day. If you do attend the Papal Audience and you want to visit the Vatican Museums afterwards, you can. The first thing you might want to consider is that right after the Papal Audience, because you're already in St. Peter's Square and you've already gone through security, you can go right into St. Peter's Basilica. So I would do that first. The audience ends around noon or so. So once you finish watching the Papal Audience and you go inside of St. Peter's Basilica and come back out, you're probably going to want a lunch break. So now you're going to have to go all the way around the walls and over to the entrance of the Vatican Museums, and you're asking, what time should you book that ticket for? I would say to book your Vatican Museums ticket for no earlier than 2 p.m. And if it were me, I would not visit the Vatican Museums this day at all because attending the Papal Audience is a lot. You have to get up early. It's a really long morning. It's very exciting and intense. And then if you want to, you can go inside of St. Peter's Basilica. And I think at that point, I would be done for the day. But I know many of you have limited time and you want to do as much as you possibly can. So if you do want to visit the Vatican Museums after this, I would schedule it for 2, 3, even 4 p.m., giving yourself that break in the middle. Now, if you want to include St. Peter's Dome in this day, you can do it. Just know it's going to be a really intense, exhausting day. And I would count on doing it right after the Papal Audience when you go inside of St. Peter's Basilica. All right, how to take a Scavi tour and also visit the Vatican Museums. The word Scavi means excavations. St. Peter's tomb is an excavation. It's an excavated site. It's underneath St. Peter's Basilica. It's also a delicate site, and it's hard to get tickets for this. I have a video all about it, so you can check that out if you want to know more about visiting St. Peter's tomb. The issue is that the way to visit St. Peter's tomb is to put in a request, and then you have to wait for an answer. I'm going to answer right now the question I get so often, which is, when do they answer you? And the answer is, I don't know. This seems to vary. Sometimes people put in a request and they get an answer the next day. Other times people put in a request and months go by before they hear anything. So you just have to be patient. So usually people put in a request and then they sort of wait and they don't hear back and they go, okay, well, I'm going to book my Vatican Museums ticket anyway. So you book your Vatican Museums ticket for say 9 a.m. and then maybe a few weeks later you get confirmation that you have been granted access to St. Peter's tomb for the same day. When they grant you this access, that's the date and time that you get, and there is no changing it. So if you want to visit St. Peter's tomb and the Vatican Museums on the same day, this is what you need to know. St. Peter's tomb is going to be a visit that lasts about an hour and a half. At the end of the visit, you end up inside of St. Peter's Basilica. You don't need to stay inside the Basilica, but you're inside, and so if you want to visit it, you're in. The Vatican Museums take about 2.5 hours to visit, as I've explained. Then you have to account for getting between these two sites, which is about 20 to 30 minutes. Take a look at a map and see where the entrance to St. Peter's tomb is, in comparison to where the entrance or exit of the Vatican Museums is. And Google Maps will show you that it's about a 20-minute walk, but give yourself 20 to 30 minutes just because you might want to walk slowly and you might not know exactly where you're going. So if you get tickets to the Scavi and then you subsequently want to book the Vatican Museums after that, just make sure you build in enough time. Give yourself that hour and a half or so to visit St. Peter's tomb, give yourself about an hour and a half to see the Basilica, and make sure to account for that time it takes to go from the Basilica all the way to the museums. Or if you get your Scavi tickets and it's for, say, 1 o'clock, you can always go to the Vatican Museums in the morning. So you'd need that 2.5 hours to visit the museums, another half an hour or so to get back to the beginning and then over to St. Peter's Square, pad in another half an hour or so, and you'll be fine visiting the Vatican Museums first thing in the morning and then going to St. Peter's tomb around 1 or 2. The problem is when you book your tickets to the Vatican Museums and subsequently get confirmation that you have tickets to St. Peter's tomb for the same day at the same time or close to the same time. I've had people ask me, what do? I booked tickets for 8 a.m. for the Vatican Museums and all of a sudden I got tickets to the Scavi for 9:30. Can I make it? My best answer is, if you wind up with 2 tickets, one for the Vatican Museums and one for St. Peter's tomb, and they're in conflict or they're too close, pick which one you really want to visit. For me, it would be St. Peter's tomb because that's a much more difficult ticket to get. And in this case, I would forfeit the Vatican Museum's tickets because you can't change the time on them, and I would simply purchase new tickets for the Vatican Museums at a time that doesn't conflict with the Scavi visit. To be really on the safe side, to visit both of these sites in the same day, I think their entry times should be about 4 hours apart. What about the Sunday Angelus or Angelus? On Sundays, when the Pope is in town, he gives the Angelus in St. Peter's Square. He starts exactly at 12 and he finishes exactly at 12:15. Most Sundays, the Vatican Museums are closed. So it wouldn't really be an option to visit the Vatican Museums on this day unless you go on the free Sunday, in which case you're going to want to go down to the Vatican Museums as early as possible because the hours are reduced and crowds are huge. But speaking just of the Angelus or Angelus, it starts at noon and you want to be in St. Peter's Square by about 20 to 12. So on this Sunday, when the Pope is going to be giving the Angelus, they move the security out because you need to go through security just to get onto St. Peter's Square. It's no longer just to get inside the Basilica, but to get onto the square. Figure it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to go through security, although for some reason I find that on Sundays when the Pope is giving the Angelus, security somehow takes less time. In either case, give yourself about half an hour to go through security. So people often ask me, what time should I get down there for the Angelus to go through security and get onto St. Peter's Square? I suggest heading down about 10 o'clock. This gives you plenty of time to go through security and you end up on St. Peter's Square. At this point, if you find you have enough time, you can go inside of the Basilica and visit it and then come back out at about 11:30, 20 to 12, so you can position yourself in the square and wait for the Pope to come out of the window and give the Angelus. If you make it to St. Peter's Square just in time for the Angelus and you don't get a chance to visit the Basilica before the fact, you can always visit it after he finishes. There's a very short window between when he finishes and when they put the security back up. So if you're in St. Peter's Square when he's giving the Angelus and right when he finishes, you may be able to get inside of the Basilica without having to go through security again. But if you wait too long, you're probably going to have to go through security a second time to get into the Basilica. Here's a secret. If you're inside of St. Peter's Basilica at 12 o'clock when the Pope is giving the Angelus and you don't participate in St. Peter's Square, you'll have the Basilica all to yourself. During the Papal Audience, the Basilica is closed to the public, but during the Angelus, it's open. Shh, don't tell anyone. Is it possible to visit St. Peter's tomb, attend the Papal Audience, visit the Vatican Museums and the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica? It's definitely possible, but you're going to need 2 separate days. First of all, the Papal Audience is held on a Wednesday, and the Scavi Tour is never available on a Wednesday. So the first thing I would do is try to get those Scavi tickets so you can work around those. Then request your Papal Audience tickets. As for the Vatican Museums and the Sistine Chapel, I would go ahead and book this after the Papal Audience in the afternoon, like I said, somewhere after 2 p.m. If you are granted Scavi tickets, I would use that day to visit St. Peter's Basilica after your Scavi visit and climb the dome if you want to. And then on the day of the Papal Audience, you could skip the Basilica and just make your way over to the Vatican Museums, stopping for lunch along the way. One last thing you can visit at the Vatican is the Vatican Gardens. Tickets to the Vatican Gardens are somewhat limited. They don't run every day. They only go in the mornings. And your ticket comes with entry to the Vatican Museums. So if you want to visit the Vatican Museums and St. Peter's Basilica on the same day that you visit the Vatican Gardens, here's what you do. You book your Vatican Gardens visit. Some of these tickets come with guided tours of the museums, and some of them come with just entry to the museums. So you're going to have to decide if you want just to visit the museums or if you also want a tour of the museums. Either way, you're going to have to leave the Sistine Chapel and go back to the beginning of the museums, which is also the exit, and then make your way all the way around to St. Peter's Square to visit St. Peter's Basilica. You could try to visit the Basilica before you go on your Vatican Gardens tour. Just remember that for the Vatican Gardens, the entry time is really strict. You can't be late or they will leave without you. And remember the logistics of visiting St. Peter's Basilica, which I think needs at least an hour, and going through security and then coming back out and making your way all the way around the walls. So if you have a Vatican Gardens visit for say 9 a.m., you could visit St. Peter's Basilica at 7 a.m. on the dot and then kind of rush to make it over to the Vatican Museums in time to meet your guide for the Vatican Gardens visit. Otherwise, I think you're just going to be a little bit more relaxed after your Vatican Museums visit, taking your time to make your way back around the walls and heading into St. Peter's Basilica, so you have all the time in the world to enjoy this amazing church. By the way, when you go inside of St. Peter's Basilica, take a look at all of the artwork. It's all mosaics, with one exception. There is one fresco inside of St. Peter's Basilica. And if you want to know where it is, check out my video right here.